Good afternoon. Nice to see everyone here today. We're thrilled to be with you for the second of a four-part series with Harvey Leven on the making of modern Israel in security and society. Remind you that Harvey is welcome to Temple Beth, both as a new member and also as an educator with a master's degree from Brandeis University in Near Eastern and Judaic Studies and a BA from the University of Pittsburgh in Judaic Studies. He's studied for many years at Israeli universities and worked around the country, including for a significant period of time at Washington Hebrew Congregation in Washington, D.C. So, Harvey, I'm going to hand things over to you. Welcome.
Thank you. Jake, let's go to the next slide. And well, that's happening. Last time we looked at early history of Israel. We looked at from the beginnings of the Zionist movement and Dreyfus and Theodor Herzl, and we went up to the beginnings of the Six-Day War in 1967. But I want to drop back for a minute to the War of Independence. Let's go to the next slide, Jake, please. And this is what happened historically after the Yeshuv, the Jewish community, accepted partition and the Arabs rejected partition. There was an 11-month war, and these were the armistice lines. Note they say armistice lines between Israel and the Arab states. The West Bank, it was part of Jordan. The West Bank was going to have been the major part of the Palestinian state, but it was annexed by the Jordanians. So we talked about what happened geographically and militarily, but I want to spend a minute or two talking about the magnitude and the significance of this event. Imagine the emotions 3 years after the Holocaust ended, and after 1900 years, the Jewish people reconstituted their national sovereignty, something that was unheard of. Nothing like this had ever happened before, nor has it happened since. It was miraculous, particularly when you thought about the 650,000 Jews living in the Yeshuv fighting off the armies of Syria, Transjordan, Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon. It was nothing short of miraculous, and that's how the Jewish community felt about it. There was a second miracle, minor comparatively, but our language, the Hebrew language, had not been spoken in 1900 years. Yet it was revived and people began speaking it again, something else that has not happened again. And a footnote to that, the Hebrew that was adopted by the Yeshuv, the Jewish community in the land of Israel, was not Ashkenazic Hebrew, like the Europeans were used to speaking. So you didn't say Shabbos anymore, you said Shabbat. You didn't say a bris, you said a brit. They used the Sephardic Hebrew, specifically because the community didn't want to be like the shtetl Jew that they came from in Eastern Europe. They wanted to be a new Jew. So that was yet another part of this miracle that had swept over the world, and particularly the Jewish community it had swept over. One final important thing till we move on. The War of Independence initiated what's become known as the Arab refugee problem. What is that? Well, during the War of Independence, about 500,000 Arab residents of what became Israel left. There were two explanations, competing explanations given for why they left. The Arab explanation was that the residents were fearful of being massacred by the Jewish forces. And they gave an example of there were two communities where indeed Jewish forces massacred people in the villages. But that wasn't the norm. The Jewish story was that the Arab countries broadcast requests to the Arab population to leave where they were, to make way for the Arab armies, and that they would come back afterwards. What's real? Well, there's some reality in both of that, but for mainly what happened is if there's a war, people wanted to get out of the way and they left. And as a result, there were 500,000 refugees who mostly moved to the West Bank, okay? And that initiated what would become called the refugee problem. Okay, let's go forward, please, Jake. Next slide. So between 1948 and 1956, Israel did a couple of amazing things, but the most important one was the absorbing of a huge number of immigrants. In those 7 years, Israel absorbed 688,000 immigrants, doubling its population. And it also did an amazing operation called the Magic Carpet, where it sent secretly planes to Yemen and brought 50,000 Yemenite Jews from Yemen to Israel. And these were people who had never seen an airplane, who lived in the 14th century, right? And they thought they were being biblically born on the wings of eagles back to the promised land. Why is it that Israel did this? And if there's anybody on Zoom who would like to unmute and try to respond to that, why did Israel absorb all these immigrants? What was the reason for it? Encourage anybody on Zoom they have a thought, to share it.
You're able to unmute or raise your hand, whatever you prefer, or put it in the chat.
Do we have Phyllis respond? Oh, I see Phyllis with a hand up. No. Okay. Anybody? Last call.
Yeah, Harvey.
Yeah,
No.
I'm Mel.
My camera's not working, but I just wanted to say that I think it may have been for a couple of reasons. One is that Israel was established to be a safe homeland for Jews from all over the world, and there were particularly a lot of immigrants coming from Europe that had been in concentration camps and were now in resettlement camps in Europe, and they needed a place to go. That was one thing. The second thing was that I think it helped to strengthen the state of Israel by populating that was, I don't know, can tell me whether that was the second motivation. The second motivation was to strengthen Israel by increasing the Jewish population in the land.
You're correct. Thank you. The main motive was the Zionist vision of what Israel was. It was the coming home of the Jewish people, okay, that we had been expelled. We didn't leave of our own volition, and now we were coming home. So that was the main thing, and I have this slide up here for you to look at, and this is quote from Deuteronomy. He will bring you together again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you, even if your outcasts are at the ends of the world. And the Lord your God will bring you to the land that your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it. So there was also a biblical view and a miraculousness that this is what God wanted. And in fact, the recreation of the state of Israel was viewed as, again, miraculous coming from God, from many people. Others who were pure secularists didn't accept that, but for some they did. So this was all what was connected here, and correct. The Zionist view was we were coming home. That's exactly right. Let's go to the next slide, please, Jake. Okay, let's skip this. Let's go to the next one. Okay, so I want to review this quickly. From the Sinai campaign, Israel got two things from Egypt: freedom and passage of all ships to and from Eilat, because in 56, the Egyptians blockaded Eilat, and there were to be UN peacekeepers on the Egyptian side of the border indefinitely. Next slide. Okay, and we went over this last week, but quickly, these are the events that happened in May of 1967. Egypt, Syria, Jordan, they form an alliance designed to eliminate Israel. They send hundreds of tanks to the border. The peacekeepers are expelled. Last week, we saw a video that showed the UN peacekeepers, I think, as they said, packing their tents and leaving. So there were no longer peacekeepers on the border. And Egypt recloses the Gulf of Aqaba for ships going to Eilat. Okay, and you can read the rest, but I have to emphasize the palpable fear that the Jewish world felt at this time. It really seemed to us like there was going to be a second Holocaust. We saw all of these tanks and military movements from the Arab states converging on little Israel. And it seemed clear what was going to happen. Let's go to the next slide, please. However, on June 5th, Israel launched a preemptive airstrike. So when Egypt closes an international waterway, imagine what would happen if the Russians or the Chinese sent ships and blockaded Boston Harbor. No ships can go into Boston. Well, that's under international law, an act of war. So here too, okay, the closing of an international waterway is an act of war. And Egypt had all of these troops, and the Syrians did, and the Jordanians did. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Well, Israel launched a preemptive attack. And as a result of that attack, in 6 days, all the area in the light blue came under Israeli control. The Sinai Peninsula in the southwest, okay, and the far left of that, you can see in small print, it says the Suez Canal. So that's where Israeli control ended, up to the Suez Canal. Up north near Syria, okay, the Syrians began shelling Jewish settlements in the valleys below. And so Israel responded and took what was known as the Golan Heights. They're called that because they looked down on Israeli territory. And then Israel pleaded with King Hussein of Jordan not to attack on the West Bank, because Israel had its hands full in the south and the north. But King Hussein, who had formed an alliance with Egypt and Syria, he couldn't restrain his commanders, and they opened fire on Jerusalem, on West Jerusalem, Jewish Jerusalem. And Israel counterattacked. In fact, they brought some troops back from the Sinai. They were paratroopers. I have one of my closest friends actually was in that group. He was a paratrooper, and he was brought back, and they then assaulted the West Bank controlled by Jordan. And in 6 days, what looked like was going to be another Holocaust suddenly was another miracle, a second miracle. The miracle was that Israel not only wasn't destroyed, but somehow vanquished all these armies. And the fact that it was in 6 days, to some people, brought back senses of, again, miracle, because the 6 days of creation. And there was a resonance with that 6 days. Let's go to the next slide. Israel offered to return all of the territories that she had won in that war, with the exception of East Jerusalem, where the Wailing Wall is, which had been a very significant part of Jewish history, to return all the Sinai to Egypt, to return the Golan to Syria, to return the West Bank to Jordan. And this was what the response was. Khartoum Conference. They published what became known as the three no's. The Arab states said there would be no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. So Israel was stuck, if you will, with these huge territories. This war did not end by a peace treaty. Instead, it ended by an armistice, the ceasefire. The same reason that in 1948, there was a ceasefire, because once you make a peace treaty with somebody, then you recognize their existence. And the Arab states were not prepared to do that. They could have had all this territory back, and they turned it down. Next slide, please. Nine months later, Passover, in the spring. Now, those of you who were with us last week may remember that I showed you a letter to my grandfather from 1926 from the Jewish National Fund, which thanked him for a $100 donation that he made to the Jewish National Fund to redeem land in Israel. Well, that Passover, my family, how old was I? 15. I went to Seder at my grandfather's house. And that year, the Seder was not, certainly to me, was not simply about what happened thousands of years ago. Because with my own eyes, I had seen 9 months earlier how the Jewish people were saved from the hands of the Egyptians. It was remarkable. It was very emotional. And to think that we were actually talking about, what God did. Now, some people believe that this was again a miracle, the 6-day war, due to military planning. Others believe this was God's hand reaching out. Still others believe God's hand is what helped Israel's military planners. Okay, so there are different views of this, but to many people, it just was a miraculous event that happened. And the pride that Jews felt at that time as Jews grew tremendously, because we identified with Israel and Israel was identified with us. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay. We're going to move forward now to October of 1973. Let me see hands. How many of you, you're here on Zoom, either you or your children or your grandchildren have taken a year of college, maybe their junior year or maybe a gap year, and went to France? Maybe they went to Paris to study, or to London or to Rome. Can I see hands? I see a couple hands. Yep, thank you, Herb. I see your hand up there. Okay. Well, in 1973, I was a junior in college, and I decided I would go to Tel Aviv University for my junior year. Now, I had spent my freshman year in Jerusalem studying, and so I already was fluent in Hebrew by this time. And in the morning on Yom Kippur, I went along with a couple friends to reform services, believe it or not, that were held on the campus of Tel Aviv University. And the Reformed service in Israel, by the way, unlike in America, because Hebrew is the common language, it's all done in Hebrew. But we went in the morning to Yom Kippur services. In the afternoon, I went back to my dorm. I was living in a dorm at Tel Aviv University and was laying on my bed. Let's go to the next slide, please. And all of a sudden, an air raid siren goes off. Now, in Israel, on Yom Kippur, nothing moves. There's no bus service. There's no radio. There's no television. There's no nothing taking place. And yet, the air raid siren is going off. My roommates, and I had 4 Israeli roommates, all were home for the holiday. So I was in this apartment myself. In other apartments were some other Americans who I was friends with. And we go down to the air raid shelters on campus because there's an air raid siren, and we try to go in and they're locked. The air raid shelters are locked. Nobody was expecting a need for them. So we go back to the room, we all come to one room, and we turn on the radio. And of course, there should not be anything playing on the radio on Yom Kippur. But there was classical music playing, which again told us something was very wrong. A few minutes later, an announcement came on in Hebrew, and again, I was able to translate for my friends, and it said, there has been a simultaneous attack by Egyptian and Syrian forces against us, and our forces are repelling the invaders. That's what the announcement, what it said. Well, it turns out that the first part of that announcement was very true. There had been an attack. The second part was nonsense. Israel was getting her butt kicked. Israel was not prepared for this. I have a cousin who all my life had told me that he worked for the State Department. And one year, much later on, my brother and I were at his house, and he pulled us aside and said, I have something to tell you. I really never worked for the State Department. I was in the CIA all this time. So my cousin is a CIA agent. I don't know this. But he's on the phone to my parents telling me, you got to get Harvey out of there. Things look very bad. He had information that nobody else had. And in fact, the situation was very, very bad. And we're going to, with this, go to the video on the flash drive, please, Jake, okay?
The Day of Atonement, 1973, the holiest day of the Jewish year. Nobody drives, no radios play. Believers give up the day to prayer and fasting. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the combined power of 3,000 artillery pieces opens fire. The invasion of the Sinai and the Golan Heights begins with a vengeance. Through the barrage, 8,000 Egyptian assault troops cross the Suez Canal in boats. In a set-piece movement practiced to perfection, they establish a bridgehead. 70,000 troops and 1,700 tanks follow them across the bridges. Against them stand a meager 436 Israeli soldiers in isolated fortifications, 7 artillery batteries, and 3 lone tanks on the canal itself. They're overwhelmed. Soon the Egyptian flag flies proudly over the east bank of the canal. Israel's first line of defense, 170 tanks, moves forward, only to be mauled by thousands of Egyptian infantry firing portable Saga anti-tank missiles. By morning, 140 tanks are just burned out shells. And Egypt holds a line 10 kilometers wide, the length of the canal. The surprise was complete. Israeli intelligence swallowed Arab propaganda that Egyptian and Syrian activity was only in response to fears of impending Israeli attacks. Out of the smoke in the north, the first of 1,500 Syrian tanks bear down on the solitary Israeli tank platoon in a forward position. Sweeping on, Syria's central thrust is met by 150 Israeli tanks. Stopped in a deathlock that lasts for 2 days and 2 nights of continuous fighting, it leaves only 15 Israeli tanks operative. On both fronts, Israeli planes crash into a solid wall of SAM missiles and conventional anti-aircraft fire. 50 jets fall in the first 3 days, victims of a desperate effort to check the Arab onslaught. A week into the war, 1,000 Egyptian tanks begin an offensive to break out of their stronghold and into the Sinai Peninsula. It was to lead to the biggest tank battle since World War II and the turning point of the war in the south.
The Israeli army.
Okay, thank you. Good, thank you. So, am I, people hearing me? Am I on audio? Yes, okay. So, when this attack happened and Israel was running out of ammunition, okay, running out of ammunition, and Israel requested help from the United States. And Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State, he arranged that there be an airlift of arms. And every half hour, an American transport plane with weapons landed at Ben Gurion Airport. And what we didn't see in the video is that at some point after a week or so, Israel managed to regroup. And in the Sinai, a general named Ariel Sharon, I don't know if you know that name, he's a former prime minister of Israel. He led a group of 30 tanks. They built a bridge and crossed the Suez Canal. So you have the Egyptians having taken 10 miles maybe into Sinai, and Sharon and his group cut a path inside that, crossed the canal, went behind the Egyptian force and cut them off. So they couldn't be reinforced either way. And this group in 95, 100-degree desert temperatures, which is what it is in October in the Sinai, was dying. They had no supplies. The Egyptians had been armed by the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union had a stake in seeing their victory. And when they saw that Israel had cut off the Egyptian Third Army and actually had a potential after that to go on to Cairo if they had wanted, but they didn't want to, the Soviet Union threatened to intervene militarily on behalf of the Egyptians. The United States then said, if you intervene militarily, so will we. And President Nixon put American nuclear forces on high alert. We were close to an altercation between the United States and the Soviet Union. Ultimately, what happened was that Israel and Egypt agreed to what they called a separation of forces, where the Egyptian forces moved back from the Sinai across from the Suez Canal, and Israel took its forces back across the Suez Canal into Sinai. And there was a ceasefire there again, okay? In the north with Syria, there was a deadly tank battle with few Israeli tanks initially holding up against an onslaught of Syrian tanks. Israel used its secret weapon there. The secret weapon is in Hebrew called En Berera, which means no choice. Because if those tanks didn't hold, there was nothing preventing the Syrian army from sweeping into the Galilee. So those tanks held, and with reinforcements, Israel then pushed further north into the Golan Heights, not all that far from Damascus, an hour or so from Damascus. And at that point, there was a ceasefire arranged. It seems that whenever Israel is winning, that the United Nations at that point decides to impose a ceasefire. When it's going the other way, that never seems to happen. So there was a ceasefire arranged, and just like in the Six-Day War and in the War of Independence, there was no peace treaty. The countries would not agree to a peace treaty. Why? For the same reason. Once you have a peace treaty, you're recognizing the existence of the other party, and they were not willing to do that. So you have this ceasefire, and this time, however, the Egyptians could be very proud of what they had accomplished. In 1967, in the Six-Day War, you saw pictures of hundreds of thousands of Egyptian troops having been captured by Israel and walking back to Egypt. They were released. This time, Egypt had made a good show, and so they were able to feel proud of what they had accomplished. But this war then ends with another ceasefire. Jake, let's go to the next slide, please. (1976), okay? 200th anniversary of American independence. You see on the left, you see the Twin Towers still standing. There was a boat parade going on to celebrate that. Can I see hands if you remember what you were doing on July 4th, 1976? I do. I see Judy does. Anybody else? Jessica remembers. Not seeing other hands, but people are not too many. Herb remembers. Okay. So I know that then I was in graduate school. I was at Brandeis University, and I was working at a Dunkin' Donuts shop to help put my way through school. And at this Dunkin' Donuts shop in Watertown, Massachusetts, they had the radio on, but very slightly, hard to hear. And there was a music station, but every once in a while they came in and interrupted with a report, and I couldn't quite hear what the report was until I was done with my shift. And then on the way home, I put on the radio. Let's go, Jake, to the next slide. On July 4th, or prior to that actually, an Air France jetliner that had initiated flight in Tel Aviv was hijacked by Palestinian terrorists and was flown to Uganda, Entebbe Airport at Uganda, where Idi Amin, who was the dictator, collaborated and cooperated with the terrorists. At one point, the non-Jewish hostages were released, but all the Jewish and all the Israeli hostages were still held. And Israel, feeling an obligation not only to its own citizens, but to Jews around the world, had a choice to make. The terrorists were demanding that hundreds of other terrorists be released from Israeli jails in exchange for the lives of the hostages. Israel had to decide whether to agree to that, and in so doing, open up the gates for further hostage taking, or to plan a military option. Now, Uganda was 2,300 miles maybe away from Israel. A military option didn't seem very feasible to most people, but yet the relatives of the hostages were banging on the gates of the prime minister's office and of the Knesset, demanding that the Arab prisoners be released. They wanted their family members back. There was lots of pressure as to what was going to happen here. But now Israel decided to act, and Jake, let's go to the next video. Not that one, the video. Nope, not the slide, Jake.
He knows. It just takes a minute to cue it up.
Okay.
It just takes, you're changing. He has to unshare, then share again. It just takes a minute.
Got it. Okay.
Well, we've been celebrating freedom here in the United States today. Israel has carried out a daring raid for freedom. Crack troops were flown 2,300 miles to Uganda for a lightning strike at Entebbe Airport to rescue hostages held for a week by the hijackers of that Air France jetliner. We have a report via satellite from Tel Aviv by Dan Bloom.
An American-built C-130 Hercules transport was the last of 3 Israeli Air Force planes to return from the daring rescue mission in Uganda. The hostages, as they poured out of the plane onto Israeli soil, were greeted joyously. Their 6-day ordeal as prisoners of the Palestinian hijackers over at last.
It was over. They renamed Operation Thunderball Operation Jonathan in honor of Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Netanyahu, who was the only Israeli soldier killed.
Thank you. Let's stop there. Let's go back to the slides now. So we're not quite ready for that one yet, Jake, so go back. Thank you. So if you caught the name of the soldier who was killed, Jonathan Netanyahu, the last name should be very familiar to us. He's the brother of Bibi Netanyahu, the former prime minister. And in many respects, it was because of his brother's death that Benjamin Netanyahu became a very well-known politician. Okay. So this rescue really revived spirits in Israel and gave, and let's say returned to the Israeli army this feeling of total respect that the population had had for the army, because during the Yom Kippur War, things did not go as planned. And yet here there was an amazing operation that did go as planned. And you may remember a number of years later, after the American embassy was taken hostage in Iran, that America tried to do a rescue similar to this of our people in the embassy, and it failed, utterly failed. And there was interesting comparison that was made. So 1976, a high point. Now, after this, now we can go to the next slide, Jake. So after this, a little bit of time passes, and remember that Egypt was able to feel proud of its performance and what it had accomplished for Arab pride in the Yom Kippur War. And Anwar Sadat, who was the president of Egypt, made an announcement, and he said, you know, the time for peace with Israel has come, and I'm willing to go even to Jerusalem, even to speak at the Knesset, in order to help bring it about. Well, this was absolutely electrifying. Never before had an Arab leader expressed willingness to sit down and talk peace. Remember the 3 no's from the Khartoum conference, and this was a huge turnabout. And Israel was elated. They couldn't believe it, that this was about to happen. Let's watch what happens when Sadat arrives. So Jake, let's go to the next video.
And if that were not change enough, barely 6 months later, President Anwar Sadat of Egypt lands at Tel Aviv airport. On his way to Jerusalem, Israelis respond enthusiastically to his courageous peace initiative. In March 1979, on the White House lawn in Washington, U.S. President Jimmy Carter hosts the signing of the peace treaty between Israel and the largest Arab state.
Thank you. Let's go back to the slides when you can. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so finally, there's a peace treaty. No more armistice lines with Egypt. 1979, there's an agreement to exchange ambassadors. What is it that Israel had to agree to do? Is there anybody in our Zoom group who may know this? What Israel agreed to do for peace? Do you want to see a hand if you'd like to?
Harvey, I think I know. This is Mel.
Go ahead, Mel.
Israel had to get back to Sinai Peninsula, right?
Exactly right. The whole Sinai Peninsula, which by the way had oil, which was needed, right, was given back to Egypt in exchange for a peace treaty. And this involved not just giving back territory that was uninhabited, but there had been a couple of cities, small cities, established that Israel had to evacuate, and the residents there were not happy to be evacuated. They were later promised other land in Israel, but Israel did that evacuation in order to have peace. And I hope you noted in the video the enthusiasm with which Sadat was greeted. Now, interestingly, while everybody was delighted Sadat was going, there was also awareness, maybe this is some kind of a trick. Who knows what might be on that plane with him coming from Egypt. And so Israel actually had sharpshooters aiming at that plane when it landed, just in case. Now, thank God it wasn't necessary, and thank God it ends like this. So there was an exchange of ambassadors, and there was a peace, not quite the peace that Israel had hoped for, not the warm peace that exists between the United States and Canada, but rather a cold kind of peace, an absence of war. But there wasn't tourism. The Israeli tourists could go to Egypt. The Egyptian tourists did not come did not come to Israel. There was not a lot of trade. So the peace treaty was more form, was more substance rather than form, because it actually worked. There was no battle, but there wasn't warmth in relations. This has changed over the years, because now there's an agreement that the ISIS terrorists who now still operate in the Sinai are threats to both countries. And so both Egypt and Israel cooperate there, and with other things as well. Egypt is instrumental in bringing about ceasefires with Hamas in Gaza, and things have warmed up. It's still not Canada and America, however. Okay, let's let's go to the next slide, Jake, for a minute. Right, so next thing that happens is a war with Lebanon, really with the PLO. The Palestine Liberation Organization had entrenched itself in southern Lebanon and was carrying out terrorist attacks inside Israel. And they also were carrying out terrorist attacks worldwide. So let's go to the next video, please, Jake.
The PLO attacks seemingly at will. Drawing strength from its leader, Yasser Arafat, it mounts a wave of terror designed to spread fear in Israel and around the world. London, June 3rd, 1982. Outside the Dorchester Hotel, Israel's ambassador Argov is gunned down by Abu Nidal's terrorist group. June 6th, 1982, 1100 hours. The first Israeli forces invade the beaches of southern Lebanon as armor and planes roar into action. Defense Minister Arik Sharon assures the Israeli cabinet that the action would be over in 48 hours.
Mr. Begin told us that he wants to move the army 40 kilometers from the border for 3 or 4 days, clean it from Katyushas, and then go back. Instead of 4 days, it began to be a war of years. Instead of 40 kilometers, the army all of a sudden arrived at the entrance of Beirut.
Early September sees over 14,000 PLO and Syrian forces leave Lebanon. Yasser Arafat, having held his position honorably throughout the whole invasion, is forced to move his headquarters from Beirut to Tunis.
This is a part of the long march to our independent state, to our capital, Palestine, Jerusalem.
In the wake of the withdrawal, to prevent intercommunal violence, the Israeli government orders its soldiers into West Beirut. But Arik Sharon takes the opportunity to surround the refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila, where, he claims, 2,000 armed PLO terrorists are hiding. The camps are then turned over to the Christian militiamen. With not a single armed PLO soldier in the camps, hundreds of unprotected men, women and children are butchered in a night of senseless slaughter.
Thank you. Let's go to the next slide when you can. And while that's coming up, would mention that the person who was speaking, by the way, was Shimon Peres, who was most recently president of Israel, and then he died within the last couple of years. Also a prime minister. He's very critical of what Sharon did in Lebanon. As you heard, he said they were going to go 40 kilometers, about 25 miles, to take care of the PLO, and instead they go to the outskirts of Beirut. And Sharon was the defense minister at the time responsible. And at the end, what we saw was became a blot on Israel, even though Israel didn't do it. But as you saw, there were refugee camps, Palestinian refugee camps in southern Lebanon. And there were two, one called Sabra, the other called Shatila. And Israel had an alliance with Lebanese Christians who were in South Lebanon, and they had militia, and Israel turned those camps over to the militia, and the militia committed that slaughter that you saw. Israel got blamed for carelessness in turning it over, and Arik Sharon was terribly blamed, probably justifiably, for his decision to do that. But the war ended in a positive way for Israel, because the PLO was expelled from Lebanon. They got on, as you saw, they got on ships and they left, okay? And so things looked promising. Let's go, please, to next slide, Jake. And I think the one after. I'm going to skip this one. Let's go to the next one. Right. Okay. So moving forward, now we're in 1993. And what do you see here? On the left is Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. On the right, Yasser Arafat. In the middle, President Bill Clinton. And in Oslo, Norway, secret talks had gotten underway between Israel and the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, to talk about peace. And interestingly, they were kept secret for a good while until finally things were pretty close to being signed. And what happened? This is the signing ceremony at the White House. And though you don't see it in this picture, Yasser Arafat offers his hand to Rabin, and Rabin is very hesitant to take it. Why? Because Arafat has lots of Israeli blood on his hands as being the leader of terrorists. But Rabin, recognizing that he's in front of the world and wanted to be the statesman, ultimately shook his hand, and they agreed on a peace deal, part of which has come to pass, part of which has not. What has come to pass is that the Palestinians were given control over some areas in the West Bank, and full control over some, and all but military control over the other. The Palestinians agreed to give up terror, and there were talks that were to be left to the end. Things had to deal with the issue of Jerusalem that both the Palestinians and the Israelis claimed as being their own. That was never resolved. The issue of the Palestinian refugees, if you remember, we talked about that from 48. So those people now had descendants, and now we're talking, instead of 500,000, we're talking 1.5 million people who are claiming they belong in Israel. That was never resolved. So in any case, that's where the situation in the West Bank today, where the Palestinian Authority, called the PA, has some rule, but Israel controls things militarily. Okay, and as you know, there is still plenty of tension between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Our fourth session, which is called Is Israel Secure, we'll take a look at that, as well as some other things. All right, let's move on because things progress. Let's go to the next slide, Jake. Okay, so now what do we have happening? Remember, in 1979, Egypt signed a peace treaty with Israel. Now, 1994, you have on the right Prime Minister Rabin, in the center Clinton, on the left King Hussein of Jordan. They agreed to a peace treaty, okay, which is again magnificent. So now 2 of Israel's borders are secure. Part of this, prior to this, however, Jordan gave up claim to the West Bank. Okay, so the West Bank was no longer part of Jordan. And by the way, previously Egypt had given up claim to the Gaza Strip. So those are areas that are today part of the Palestinian territories. All right, let's move forward. You can stay on this slide for a minute, but I want to talk about something that happened in 2005. And I think it's important to know this. Jessica, I'm conscious of time, so I know we just have a couple of minutes left. Israel had controlled the Gaza Strip from the time of the Six-Day War, and in fact had built settlements there and some farmland, but there was a lot of terror attacks against the Israeli population there, and it took a huge contingent of soldiers to protect them, and it became very unpopular. So in 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew from the Gaza Strip. So there were no Israeli forces in Gaza. Israel left farm equipment and stuff in the farming areas, but the Palestinians who then came in destroyed these farms. They were because they were Israeli, had set them up. So Israel does not occupy the Gaza Strip. Okay, so when you hear talk about that, keep this in mind. Gaza shares a border with Israel that is tightly controlled because Israel is concerned that supplies going in are used for war materials. For instance, cement going in might be used to build houses. But Israel found that cement going in was actually used to build tunnels underneath Israel's border with Gaza, where they were using as military operations to kidnap Israelis. Egypt also shares a border with Gaza. Okay, you rarely hear anything about, Egypt's responsibility there. So just to keep that in mind. And because we're about at the end of our time, we're going to end with some good news, and then I have some preview of what's coming. Let's go to the next slide, please. Next slide after that. And the slide after that. There we go, that one. Okay, this is something that most of you probably remember. A year, just over, almost a year and a half ago, Israel signs the Abraham Accords. And these are, now there had never been a war between the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel, or Bahrain and Israel, but nor had there been peace. But now there is formal peace, and these two countries were added to those that had signed peace agreements with Israel. And Israel has been very active economically with the UAE, and there are reports of Israel conducting military strategy with UAE, and the one they're both concerned about, the country, is Iran. So today we have in Israel peace with Egypt, peace with Jordan. However, there are terrorist bodies in Lebanon. A group called Hezbollah controls southern Lebanon, has 150,000 missiles available to shoot at Israel. Hamas, another terrorist group, controls Gaza. So there are issues there. We'll be talking about these the fourth session. But the good news is Israel has peace with multiple Arab countries now. And economically, Israel is doing very, very, very well. I want to take one final moment for the presentation that we saw this week and last. What I hope you glean from it is that throughout her history, Israel has been hoping for peace with her neighbors. And every time she would offer peace, it was turned down until lately. So really, we have good news lately. Egypt, Jordan, these two countries. Pretty good news in my view. Finally, I want to take a moment to talk about next week's presentation. Next week's presentation is called The Balance Between Israel Being a Jewish State and a Democracy. And what is that balance, and how do you weigh the two? And we're going to look at Israeli laws that deal with that. We're also going to touch at the end upon the Amnesty International report calling Israel an apartheid state. We'll look if that really has legs to stand on. And also for next week, it will be very important. It will not be so much lecture as it's going to be participation. So please, next week, come on Zoom and be ready to speak. I'm going to ask people to do readings. I'm going to ask people for questions. So please come next week ready for that. And Jessica, I'm done at this point.
Thanks so much, Harvey, and thanks everyone for joining. Thanks our awesome producer, Jake, who's behind the scenes doing all this. Everyone have a wonderful week. Remember, there's a lot going on at Temple this weekend. Friday night is our interfaith service with a seminary professor from Tampa, Monsignor Basso, and Sunday is the Maccabees at Temple. If you like music, they are a fabulous musical group, very, very famous, do great covers and original stuff. And So it's a busy week at Temple, as always is. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Have a great week. Thanks, Harvey.
Shirley.